The barrel of the Glock 19 was still hot, filling the room with the acrid scent of cordite. He loomed over her, a shadow in a bespoke suit, his voice a lethal rumble. "Who told you to hide?" he growled. Her trembling answer didn't just shock him, it stopped a war. Beatrice Gallagher was entirely too familiar with the art of disappearing in plain sight. At 240 pounds, society had a funny way of making her invisible. In her former life as a senior forensic auditor at KPMG, she had learned that people rarely looked twice at the fat girl in the sensible navy torrid blazer. They assumed she was harmless, a background character in their own corporate dramas. They didn't guard their screens when she walked past. They didn't lower their voices in the break room. To them, she was just B, the quiet woman with the thick thighs and the oversized Mulberry tote bag, perpetually sipping from a lukewarm cup of Keurig coffee. It was this exact invisibility that had landed her the most lucrative and undeniably dangerous freelance contract of her life. She was sitting in a windowless third-floor office in South Philadelphia, right off Washington Avenue. The building nominally belonged to Bravura Imports, a high-end olive oil and cured meats distribution center. In reality, it was the financial nerve center for the Rossi syndicate, a fact Bayard had deduced precisely 48 hours into her contract. Arthur Collins, the nervous, sweating CFO of Bravura, had brought her in under the guise of an internal compliance audit. He wanted her to find inefficiencies. What Bayard had actually found, buried under layers of falsified QuickBooks entries and shell companies in Delaware, was a massive, bleeding financial hemorrhage. Someone was siphoning money out of the Rossi family accounts at an alarming rate. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, headache-inducing buzz. Bayard adjusted her plus-size reading glasses, her finger tracing a printed spreadsheet. She tapped her pen against the heavy mahogany desk. "Arthur," she called out, her voice calm but firm. Arthur, a thin man in a rumpled Brooks Brothers shirt, jumped. He had been pacing near the heavy steel security door for the last 20 minutes. "What? Did you find something?" "I found a lot of things," Bea said, pulling a stack of invoices toward her. "But specifically, I'm looking at these routing numbers. $50 million over the last 6 months hasn't been going to your legitimate suppliers in Naples. It's been routed through a crypto tumbler and deposited into a numbered account at UBS in Zurich. And the authorization codes on the transfers?" She looked up, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "They're yours, Arthur." All the color drained from Arthur's face. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death certificate. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain. Instead, his hand dove into his pocket, pulling out a cheap plastic burner phone. He typed a frantic message, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. "Arthur?" Bea asked, a cold knot of dread finally forming in her ample stomach. "What did you do?" Before Arthur could answer, the heavy, muffled sound of tires screeching echoed from the alleyway below. It was a distinct, expensive sound, the heavy suspension of a convoy of Audi A8s slamming to a halt. Arthur gasped. "He's early. Oh God, he wasn't supposed to be here until Friday." "Who?" Bea stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Declan," Arthur breathed out, the name sounding like a curse. Declan Rossi, the head of the family. The man who had taken over the syndicate 2 years ago and ruthlessly modernized it. Bayard had never met him, but she had seen the numbers. You could tell a lot about a man by how he handled his money. Declan was aggressive, highly organized, and absolutely merciless. Heavy rhythmic thuds echoed from the stairwell. Work boots, dress shoes, men moving with tactical precision. Then came a sound that made the blood freeze in B's veins. Thwip, thwip, suppressed gunfire. The dull, heavy thuds of bodies hitting the concrete floor one level down. "Arthur, call the police," B shouted, instinctively reaching for her iPhone. Arthur let out a hysterical, breathless laugh. He scrambled to the heavy steel security door of the office. "The police work for him, you stupid cow!" He slammed the deadbolt shut, locking them in. But he didn't stop there. Arthur grabbed his leather briefcase, rushed to the private elevator at the back of the office, an elevator B had been told was strictly out of order, and slammed his palm against a hidden biometric scanner. The doors slid open silently. "Wait! You can't leave me here!" B yelled, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I need a distraction," Arthur said, his eyes wild with terror. "Sorry, B." He stepped inside. The elevator doors shut, leaving Bear entirely alone in the massive, silent office. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. In movies, the lithe, beautiful heroine would climb into the air ducts, or scale the building's exterior, or execute a perfect judo throw. Bear looked at her body, soft, heavy, unapologetically fat, and knew none of those options were viable. She couldn't run. The single window was barred. The steel door was already rattling as someone on the other side began to kick at it with terrifying force. Boom! Boom! The hinges groaned. They were going to breach the room in seconds. B looked frantically around the sparsely furnished office. There was nowhere to go. Her eyes landed on the massive antique oak credenza pushed against the far wall. There was a 6-inch gap between the back of the furniture and the wall, obscured in deep shadow. It was going to be a tight fit. Too tight. But adrenaline is a powerful equalizer. B scrambled across the room. She threw her mulberry tote bag into the dark corner, then dropped to her hands and knees. She squeezed herself into the narrow gap behind the credenza. The rough wood scraped against her blazer, the dust making her nose itch violently. She had to forcefully exhale, flattening her large breasts and pulling her stomach in as far as humanly possible, wedging herself in the darkness. She pulled her knees up, making herself as small as a big woman could possibly be, and clamped both hands over her mouth. Just as she squeezed her eyes shut, a massive explosion rocked the room. The steel door didn't just open, it was blown off its reinforced hinges by a breaching charge. Smoke and the bitter smell of explosives flooded the office. Heavy footsteps poured in. Glass crunched under boots. B stopped breathing. She became the shadows. She became invisible. "Clear the room," a rough, gravelly voice commanded. Files were swept off desks. Chairs were kicked over. B could hear the frantic ripping of paper and the smashing of electronics as men tore Arthur's office apart looking for him. "Boss," a younger voice called out. "The private elevator. It's descending to the sub-basement. He's making a run for the subway tunnels." There was a heavy pause. Then a slow, deliberate set of footsteps entered the room. The stride was measured, unhurried, radiating an aura of absolute authority. "Send Leo and the twins to the tunnels. If Arthur resists, break his legs. If he doesn't resist, break them anyway," the man ordered. Bea squeezed her eyes tighter. Declan Rossi. His voice was deeper than she expected, a dark, resonant baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the voice of a man who commanded violence like a conductor leading an orchestra. "You got it, boss. What about the rest of this?" "Burn it," Declan replied casually. "He's had weeks to doctor these files. Whatever is on that desk is fiction." Bee's eyes snapped open in the dark. Burn it. If they set fire to the office, she would be roasted alive behind the credenza. A fresh wave of sheer, unadulterated panic washed over her. Her chest heaved against the tight constraint of the wood and drywall. She tried to stifle a gasp, but the dust from the breaching charge had settled in her throat. She let out a tiny, stifled cough. It wasn't louder than a mouse's squeak, but in the sudden quiet of the room, it might as well have been a siren. The heavy footsteps stopped instantly. Silence descended on the office, heavy and suffocating. Bee could hear her own heartbeat roaring in her ears. "Out," Declan said softly to his men. "Boss?" "I said get out. Secure the perimeter." The door shut. Now there were only two people in the room. Declan Rossi and the fat accountant wedged behind a piece of furniture. The footsteps moved closer, agonizingly slow. They stopped right in front of the credenza. Bee stared at the polished leather of his handmade Italian Oxfords through the tiny gap at the bottom. "I can hear you breathing." Declan's voice floated down, eerily calm. "I can smell your perfume. Vanilla and panic. You have exactly 3 seconds to come out, or I start shooting through the wood." I wasn't bluffing. The metallic clack of a round being chambered into a Glock echoed like a gavel striking a block. 1. Bee couldn't move. Fear had paralyzed her muscles. 2. "Please," Bee managed to croak out, her voice cracking. "I'm stuck." A beat of silence, then a heavy sigh. Suddenly, the massive 300-pound solid oak credenza was gripped by 2 large hands. With a grunt of exertion, Declan Rossi physically dragged the heavy furniture away from the wall, tearing the carpet in the process. Light flooded Bee's hiding spot. She shrank back against the drywall, pulling her knees to her chest, her torrid blazer smeared with dust, her hair a frizzy mess. She looked up, expecting to see a monster. Declan Rossi was terrifying, but not in the way she had pictured. He was tall, over 6'3", with broad, muscular shoulders, filling out a dark, bespoke Tom Ford suit. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and a vintage silver Rolex Daytona gleamed on his left wrist. But it was his eyes that froze her in place. They were a piercing, icy gray, completely devoid of warmth. He held the Glock 19 in his right hand, aimed squarely at her forehead. He didn't look surprised by her size. He didn't look disgusted. He just looked calculating, assessing her like a puzzle piece that didn't fit into the picture he had painted. "Well," Declan murmured, tilting his head, "you certainly don't look like one of Arthur's usual hired guns." Bee couldn't speak. She hugged her knees tighter, trying to shield her vital organs with her thick arms. Declan stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. The barrel of the gun was still hot from his entrance downstairs, the acrid scent of cordite clinging to his clothes. He looked down at her, a muscle feathering in his sharp jawline. "Who told you to hide?" he growled, the threat in his voice absolute. It was the question of an apex predator. He assumed she was a spy, a mole, or a rat. He assumed she was hiding from him because she was guilty. Bea knew that in this world, silence meant a bullet. Weakness meant a bullet. The only thing these men respected was leverage. B took a shuddering breath. She looked past the gun, directly into the icy grey eyes of the most dangerous man in Philadelphia. Her terror abruptly crystallized into a sharp, crystalline anger. Arthur had left her to die. She wasn't going to take the fall for a skinny, cowardly embezzler. Her trembling answer didn't just shock him, it stopped a war. "Arthur," B said, her voice suddenly steadying, ringing out clear in the destroyed office. "Right after he wired your $50 million to a shell company in Zurich, locked the door, and left me in here to take your bullet." Complete, absolute silence descended upon the room. Declan didn't pull the trigger. He didn't blink. The air between them grew impossibly thick. The icy indifference in his eyes fractured, replaced by a sudden, intense sharpness. "Repeat that," Declan said, his voice dropping an octave, dangerously low. "I'm Beatrice Gallagher," she said, pushing herself up slightly, though she remained on the floor. "I'm a forensic auditor. Arthur hired me to fake a compliance report to cover his tracks. But I found the ledger. He's been stealing from you for 6 months, Mr. Rossi. And unless you put that gun down and let me get to my laptop, that money is going to bounce through 3 different international servers in the next 10 minutes, and you will never see a dime of it again." Declan stared at her. His gaze dropped to the messy stack of printed spreadsheets on the desk, then back to the plus-size woman cowering on his floor. She was terrified, sweating, and covered in dust. But she was looking at him with the defiant glare of someone who knew exactly how much she was worth. Slowly, deliberately, Declan lowered the Glock. He didn't holster it, but the immediate threat of execution passed. A heavy, dark amusement danced in his cold eyes. He reached out a large, calloused hand toward her. "Get up, Miss Gallagher," the Mafia boss murmured, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smirk. "It seems we have some accounting to do." B did not take his hand. Instead, she gripped the edge of the credenza, her knuckles white, and hauled her 240-pound frame up from the floor. Her knees popped in the quiet room, a stark contrast to the smooth, lethal silence of the Mafia boss watching her. She dusted off her torrid blazer, acutely aware of how disheveled she must look. But as she moved toward the mahogany desk, her fear began to recede, replaced by the cold, comforting logic of numbers. Numbers did not carry guns. Numbers did not lie. Declan Rossi leaned against the doorframe, his Glock 19 now resting casually against his thigh. He watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It wasn't the usual dismissive gaze she received from men in power. It was the focused, predatory calculation of a man evaluating a highly prized asset. B flipped open her battered Lenovo ThinkPad. The screen glowed, illuminating her face in the dim, smoke-filled office. "You have a secure network?" she asked, her voice rasping slightly from the cordite in the air. "Military-grade encryption," Declan replied smoothly, "routed through a proxy server in Reykjavik." "Why?" "Because Arthur is sloppy," B said, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that defied her heavy frame. He used a standard NordVPN protocol to mask the initial wire transfer, but he left his Bloomberg terminal session active on this secondary monitor. He's trying to execute a smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain to tumble the 50 million before it hits the UBS account in Zurich. Declan's jaw tightened. "English, Miss Gallagher. He's running your money through a digital washing machine, B translated, her eyes glued to the scrolling lines of code. Once the smart contract executes, the 50 million shatters into 10,000 microtransactions. It comes untraceable, irrecoverable. He set a time delay on the execution to give himself a head start. "How much time?" Declan asked, stepping closer. The scent of him, expensive vetiver, sharp gunpowder, and dark coffee, washed over her. B glanced at the digital timer ticking down in the corner of her screen. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. "Can you stop it?" "I'm an auditor, Mr. Rossi, not a hacker," B said, her heart hammering as she pulled up the network's administrative console. "But Arthur is a creature of habit. I spent the last 3 days mapping his digital footprint. He uses the same alphanumeric baseline for his master passwords, tweaking only the seasonal suffixes." She hammered a sequence into the override prompt. "Bravura Fall 2026. Access denied." She gritted her teeth, sweat beading on her forehead. "Bravura Winter. Access denied." 2 minutes, Declan noted, his voice devoid of panic, which somehow made the situation infinitely more terrifying. He reached into the inner pocket of his Tom Ford suit, withdrew a silver flask, and unscrewed the cap. He took a slow sip, his icy grey eyes never leaving her face. B stared at the screen. Think like Arthur. Nervous, greedy, utterly unimaginative Arthur. I was stealing $50 million. What was his ultimate goal? Where did he want to be? She typed furiously, "Cayman retirement." The screen flashed green. Administrator access granted. B let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She immediately isolated the IP address pinging the Zurich server and initiated a hard sever of the network bridge. She overrode the smart contract's execution protocol, forcing an immediate reversal of the pending ledger blocks. On the screen, the $50 million hovered in digital purgatory, then slowly, agonizingly, began to funnel back into the primary Rossi syndicate holding accounts. "Got it," B whispered, slumping back into the heavy leather desk chair. "The transfer is The funds are locked behind your internal firewall." He didn't get a dime. Declan walked around the desk. He leaned over her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his massive chest. He looked at the screen, verifying the zeros resting safely in his account. Then he looked at Bea. "You just saved me $50 million, Beatrice Gallagher," he murmured, his voice a dark, velvety rumble that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I suppose that makes us even for the door." B swallowed hard, trying to ignore the proximity of a man who was objectively terrifying and entirely too masculine. "You can let me go now. I've done what you need. I won't say a word to the police." "Go?" Declan chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "I think not. Arthur was a thief, but he was right about one thing. My books are a mess. I need someone to clean them up." "I am not working for the Mafia," Bea stated, finding a sudden, bizarre well of courage. "I am a legitimate CPA." Before Declan could answer, the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed in the hallway. Declan had called Leo, stepped into the ruined office. He was built like a heavyweight boxer, with a broken nose and eyes that looked like dead, black stones. He carried an MP5 submachine gun slung across his chest. "Boss," Leo grunted, his eyes darting suspiciously toward B. Arthur slipped the net. He had a secondary exit blown into the subway access tunnel. The twins lost him in the maintenance shafts. Declan's expression darkened, the faint amusement vanishing instantly. You let a middle-aged accountant outrun you? He had help, Leo said defensively. An extraction team, professionals, looked like O'Connor's men. The O'Connor Syndicate, the Rossi family's oldest and bloodiest rivals in the city. Declan's posture went rigid. If the O'Connors have Arthur, they have the entire financial blueprint of this organization. Every shell company, every offshore account, every paid-off politician. He swore softly, a vicious Italian curse. B, however, was no longer looking at Declan. Her eyes were glued to her laptop screen. The administrative dashboard she had left open was blinking with a subtle, yellow warning notification. It was a background process, something buried deep in the server's architecture, executing a silent data siphon. "Wait," B said, leaning forward, her thick fingers dancing across the keys. "Quiet," Leo snapped, raising a hand. "The adults are talking, sweetheart." Declan shot Leo a glare so venomous. The larger man actually took a half-step back. "Let her speak." B traced the source of the data siphon. "Arthur didn't just try to steal $50 million, she said, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "He initiated a massive data dump. Someone is downloading your entire encrypted server. The ledgers, the blackmail files, everything." "Can you stop it?" Declan demanded. "I am trying, but this isn't Arthur's coding," B said, her eyes widening as she read the digital signature. "This is a direct, hard-wired siphon. It's not coming from outside the building via the O'Connors. It's coming from inside." "Inside?" Declan frowned. "Where?" Bea ran a traceroute command. The IP address resolved on the screen in bright, damning green text. She looked up, her gaze bypassing Declan and landing squarely on the heavyweight enforcer standing in the doorway. "It's pinging a localized subnet," B said slowly, the realization dawning cold and sharp. "It's routing directly to a device on this floor. Specifically, the secure mobile network assigned to a MAC address registered to Leo." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and lethal. Time seemed to fracture, slowing down to a crawl. B watched the subtle, terrifying shift in Leo's posture. The big enforcer didn't deny it. He didn't gasp or try to formulate an excuse. Instead, his dead black eyes locked onto Bea with pure, unadulterated hatred, and his hand moved with terrifying speed toward the grip of his MP5. "You fat, lying Leo snarled, raising the weapon. B screamed, throwing her arms over her head and diving sideways out of the heavy leather chair. But Declan Rossi was faster. He moved with a brutal, liquid violence that defied his tailored suit. He didn't bother raising the Glock. Instead, he lunged across the mahogany desk, his massive hand shooting out to grab the barrel of Leo's submachine gun, violently redirecting it upward. A deafening burst of automatic fire shredded the acoustic ceiling tiles, raining white plaster dust down upon them. Declan twisted the hot barrel of the MP5, snapping Leo's wrist with a sickening crunch. Leo bellowed in pain, letting go of the weapon. Before the enforcer could draw the combat knife at his belt, Declan pivoted, driving a devastating knee into Leo's abdomen, followed by a vicious, cracking elbow strike to the man's temple. Leo crumpled to the hardwood floor, a lifeless, bleeding heap of muscle. The ringing in B's ears was unbearable. She lay on the floor, curled into a tight ball, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath through the thick, choking cloud of plaster dust. Footsteps approached her. Slow, deliberate. Declan crouched down beside her. He tossed the MP5 onto the ruined desk. His breathing was completely even, as if he hadn't just engaged in a life-or-death struggle. He reached out, gently grasping her thick upper arm, and helped her into a sitting position against the side of the desk. "Are you hit?" he asked, his cold eyes scanning her frantically for blood. No, Bea stammered, trembling violently. "I'm okay. I'm fine." She wasn't fine. She was surrounded by bullet holes, a bleeding mobster, and the head of the Rossi syndicate. Her sensible life as a corporate auditor was officially dead and buried beneath the rubble of this office. Declan looked at the unconscious Leo, then back to Bea's laptop screen, which still displayed the aborted data siphon. "Arthur was the distraction," Declan murmured, piecing it together. "He embezzled the money to draw my attention, knowing I would come here to execute him. Meanwhile, Leo, who has full physical access to my servers, downloads the family's entire operational blueprint to sell to the O'Connors. A hostile takeover from the inside." He looked down at Bea. The icy, terrifying detachment in his gaze had vanished, replaced by a profound, burning intensity. "You didn't just save my money, Beatrice. You saved my empire. You saved my life." Bea pushed her messy hair out of her face, leaving a streak of white plaster across her cheek. "You're welcome," she muttered, attempting a weak smile. "Can I go home now? I think my contract with Bravura Imports is officially terminated." "No," Declan said softly, leaning in closer. He reached up, his thumb gently brushing the plaster dust from her cheek. The touch was completely unexpected, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "Your contract with her is terminated. Your employment with me begins right now." Bea stared at him, her heart doing a frantic, fluttering dance in her chest. "Mr. Rossi—" "Declan," he corrected, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "I am surrounded by men who view brawn and brutality as the only currencies of power. They are predictable. They are easily bought. But you—" He let his hand trail down, resting lightly on her shoulder. "You sat in a room with a gun to your head and outsmarted the two most dangerous men in my organization using nothing but a keyboard and a brilliant mind." He stood up, towering over her, extending his hand once again. "I need a chief financial officer, Beatrice. Someone who isn't afraid of the dark. Someone who understands that real power isn't about being the loudest or the most violent person in the room. It's about seeing the threads that control the puppets." Bea looked at his massive, calloused hand. She thought about her cramped apartment. She thought about the sneering partners at KPMG who passed her over for promotion because she didn't fit the corporate image. She thought about a lifetime of making herself small, of blending into the background, of being invisible. She looked at Declan Rossi. He didn't see an invisible fat woman. He saw a queen. He saw a weapon. Slowly, Bea reached up and placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, and incredibly strong. He pulled her up to her feet, bringing her flush against his chest. "What are my benefits?" Bea asked, lifting her chin, her dark eyes locking with his icy grey ones. A slow, devastatingly handsome smile spread across Declan's face. "Whatever you want them to be, Mia Regina." The forensic auditor adjusted her plus-size blazer, stepped over the bleeding body of the cartel enforcer, and went to work. If B's brilliant, badass takedown of the underworld kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. We love bringing you thrilling, high-stakes drama, where the smartest woman in the room finally gets the crown she deserves. Share this video with your friends who love a spicy, suspenseful mafia romance with a twist. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more intense, real-life inspired storytelling every single week. See you in the next one.